have the Ayatollah of fantasy rock and roller with us today, Adam Rank. How you doing, Rank?
They look great in person, and I just can't wait till next year where we can pack it full of 25,000.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. I didn't know it was Ball Guys Day. It was being ranked. I mean, how can you lose?
This is the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast.
Well, hello there, and welcome to the Dynasty Vipers ViperCast. This is episode 160, presented by the Fantasy Points Media Group. Head over to fantasypoints.com today, right up into the Super Bowl, and you can get yourself 30% off that subscription. That's right, 30% off. Merry Christmas, courtesy of our friends over at fantasypoints.com. Now, we are here not only to give you 30% off of fantasypoints.com, but we're also here to help you earn a spot into your fantasy football championship games. But before we get into this week's slate of games, the starts and sits, all that fun stuff, we have to go through the negatives here. We have to talk about the injuries because there are more injuries to some key positions here each and every week, and they continue to add up. Starting with here, Lamar Jackson, it looks like he is going to miss another week. We haven't seen him at practice, so do not expect him to be there on Sunday. Also, Jalen Hurts, will he play? Will he not play? Will the Jort man himself come out there? Gardner Minshew. Now, hey, if Gardner Minshew's on the waivers, he's worth a speculative ad at this point because I'm not sure if Jalen Hurts is going to play, but if there is a player that is physically and mentally tough enough to come back on a short week's notice there, it is going to be Jalen Hurts. Cortland Sutton there, he is still dealing with that hamstring injury. Tyler Lockett, we know he's not going to be there. He's got that broken, dislocated finger. Mike White folded up like a lawn chair on the 4th of July. He's not going to be available for Thursday Night Football. So maybe you have to downgrade Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson, and definitely those running backs, especially in PPR leagues there. Deebo Samuel is still dealing with that knee injury. Russell Wilson, Kenny Pickett, concussions to keep an eye on here. It looks as though that Kenny Pickett is going to be able to play. Treylon Burks, Corey Davis, another couple guys there dealing with concussions there. Although it sounds like Corey Davis will be there on Thursday Night Football because we're going to talk about that in just a second when we preview the New York Jets versus the Jacksonville Jaguars Thursday Night Football on prime time. Now, talking about some of these other things that took place here just in the recent days. Nick Chubb, Myles Garrett did not participate in practice there on Wednesday. Probably nothing, but something you should probably be monitoring anyway. Trace McSorley is now going to be starting at quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals. Downgrade Marquise Brown. Downgrade DeAndre Hopkins. This might actually help James Conner because Trace McSorley, he can run a little bit, he can scramble a little bit, but he sure the heck can't throw the ball. Gardner Minshew, we talked about that being in for Hurts. Nick Foles is now the man there in Indianapolis, taking over for Matt Ryan here in week number 16. And finally, what is old is new again in Baltimore. What one man's trash is another man's treasure, I guess, so to speak. Well, when it comes to Sammy Watkins, I don't know if any of that's true, but he is now a Baltimore Raven. That's not the only news that came out of the windwork here the last couple days here. Just today here on Wednesday, the NFL announced the Pro Bowl rosters. A little bit of surprises there, some not surprised. The first one off the get-go is Tua Tagovailoa not being a Pro Bowler despite leading the whole fan voting category. That means that's only 1/3 of the equation. That means 1/3 of the players and 1/3 of the coaches did not think of Tagovailoa there as one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the AFC. Instead, those honors went to, as you would expect, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, who was named the starter, and Joe Burrow was the 3rd quarterback selected for the AFC roster. Moving along to the running back position, not much of a shock here, except for the fact that Austin Eckler was left off in favor of Nick Chubb, Josh Jacobs there, and of course, Derrick Henry. Now, we know what these guys can do. Josh Jacobs is right there leading the league in rushing yards. We know that Derrick Henry is probably going to be right up there because he's going to play the Houston Texans this week, so that's going to shoot his value up there. But Nick Chubb, it seems a bit of a surprise to me here, especially when we're talking about Austin Eckler being snubbed. At the wide receiver positions, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Jamar Chase, despite not playing the same amount of games as some of these other players. No real shockers there. Those are the top 4 wide receivers in the AFC, in my opinion. At tight end, no surprise here. It's Travis Kelce, especially we're talking about the tight end position here for fantasy. It's Travis Kelce and everybody else. Luckily for Mark Andrews, they decided to include a second tight end there in the AFC. And of course, on the offensive line, Teron Armstead, Joel Patino, Orlando Brown, Quentin Nelson, Joe Thuney there, Creed Humphrey, Mitch Morse. No big shocks again there along the offensive line. Defensively speaking for the AFC, I'll just quickly go over these guys. Max Crosby, Trey Hendrickson, Myles Garrett, Chris Jones, Quinnen Williams, Jeffrey Simmons, Matt Judon, Khalil Mack, TJ Watt. Hey, you don't need to play a full season to become a Pro Bowler, especially 1 year as efficient and as effective as TJ Watt has been. Roquan Smith, I mean, he played a couple games there in Baltimore, I guess, prior to the Pro Bowl voting. So, yeah, let's throw him as a Pro Bowler for the AFC. CJ Mosley, Sauce Gardner, Patrick Surtain, Marlon Humphrey, Xavier Howard, Minka Fitzpatrick there, and Derwin James, Jordan Poyer. I mean, that's just the AFC. We're not going to get into the special teams because, you know what? I know kickers are people too, but I'd rather not talk about them today. Now, on the NFC, probably the biggest snub, we're going to start at the running back position because Christian McCaffrey was not a Pro Bowler this season, despite having more all-purpose yards, more yards from scrimmage than any of the other running backs that were selected ahead of him, including Miles Sanders and Tony Pollard. I don't think anyone here is going to argue Saquon Barkley being a Pro Bowler, but when it comes to Pollard and Sanders, that's going to have a lot of people questioning the validity of the whole Pro Bowl selection. Jalen Hurts, Geno Smith, Kirk Cousins, all deserving at the quarterback position. And then at wide receiver, you can probably make some arguments here and there as far as wide receivers are concerned, but you got A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Terry McLaurin, and Justin Jefferson. If we look at the wide receiver position for fantasy right now into PPR-type leagues, we're basically covered everything that we want to cover there at the wide receivers. Justin Jefferson, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, A.J. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown was number 6 right now in fantasy scoring. CeeDee Lamb, Tyler Lockett, perhaps maybe considered a snub there, who is the number 8 wide receiver. Jalen Waddle, Christian Kirk round out the top 10 as far as fantasy perspective is concerned. Now, going back to the Pro Bowlers there, just because we have to, George Kittle, T.J. Hawkins, and I mean, I guess they're Pro Bowl caliber players this season. I mean, I haven't really seen it so much because the tight end position has been such a wasteland. It is like the nether realm there in Mortal Kombat. Then we move on to the offensive line. Trent Williams, Lane Johnson, Tristan Wirfs, Zach Martin, Landon Dickerson, Chris Lindstrom, Jason Kelsey, and Frank Ragnow. And, dude, he is a mover and a shaker there. And Jamal Williams probably owes about 13 of his 14 touchdowns to the big man there, Frank Ragnow. Now, Nick Bosa, Brian Burns, DeMarcus Lawrence, all selected at the defensive end position for the NFC. Aaron Donald, Jonathan Allen, Dexter Lawrence, Micah Parsons there, Zadarius Smith, Hassan Reddick, Fred Warner, Demario Davis, Darius Slay, Trevon Diggs, Tariq Woolen there, Jair Alexander, Quandre Diggs, Buda Baker, and then Talano Hafanga there on the San Francisco 49ers rounds out the defense for the NFC. And that right there, my friends, is your news and notes for week number 16. Now, I got to talk about my winners and losers here. And for me, the biggest winner in week number 15 was Zay Jones. 109 yards receiving, 3 touchdowns, 34.9 fantasy points. Now he is less than 300 yards away from 1,000 yards with 3 games to go. Why is that important? Well, it's significant because we know that Christian Kirk is going to accomplish this feat for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver. Well, Jacksonville hasn't had a 1,000-yard receiver since about 2014, the year of the Allens, when both Allen Robinson had 1,400 yards and Allen Hurns had just over 1,000. So they could have a duo there in Duval County, the Duval duo of 1,000-yard receivers. So, hey, maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing, but I wanted to make sure that we gave Zay Jones the proper send-off here. Now, the guy, my biggest loser, outside of fantasy managers, is probably going to be Jonathan Taylor. It's been one of those years for a player who has not suffered very many injuries so far. Now, he's dealt with more than his fair share this season to kind of make up for his career so far. But when you exit a big-time playoff game for fantasy managers after 1 target and 13 yards, and then you end up on the IR a little bit later this week, I mean, that is going to sting just a little bit more than what some people may want to kind of admit right now. So, Jonathan Taylor, no fault of your own because injuries happen. We get it, but you are the biggest loser for me in week number 15. With that said, we are now moving on. Hey, forget about week 15. We're here to get you into those fantasy championships. And that starts by winning your fantasy semifinals right here, right now. And it starts on Thursday Night Football. And boy, you know what? When the schedule makers threw this game out there at the beginning of the season, Jacksonville versus the New York Jets, I looked at this game and kind of chuckled. What kind of fantasy relevance is this game going to have? Zach Wilson versus Trevor Lawrence. I mean, maybe this was not the matchup that was supposed to happen, but this is the matchup that the NFL actually wanted. The battle of the first two selections in the 2021 NFL draft going head-to-head once again. Now, the Jets, they took this the first time there. Zach Wilson, he had about 100 yards passing there and a touchdown, 91 yards rushing on 4 carries and a touchdown, where the Jets beat the Jaguars last season. That being said, these are not the same two teams that we saw last season. These are two playoff caliber teams right now, and it doesn't take a whole heck of a lot to notice that both these teams are literally fighting for their playoff lives. Now, don't look now, but the boys there from Duval, they are right there battling for that AFC South championship and that spot in that playoffs. A win this week, they get to 7 against the 7-7 Jets, who themselves are battling for that final playoff spot, considering that the Dolphins hold that last spot there at 8-6. Meanwhile, the Jaguars, they win, the Titans lost, and we've got ourselves a brand new ball game in that AFC South. So this is one of those games that is absolutely catching my eye this week, especially when you consider that the Jaguars right now, they've actually outscored their opponents despite their record, 334 points for to 328 points against. It's a +6 point differential right now. Meanwhile, a team like the Minnesota Vikings, who's 11-2 and essentially cruising into the playoffs, if you want to call it that. I mean, they literally spotted a team 33 points a week ago and won 39-36 in overtime. But the Vikings, they only have a +2 differential as far as points for and points against are concerned. Now, I love myself the matchups inside the matchups, and this game is no different. Hey, maybe it's an open wide. He can get some running game going on there. Maybe Travis Etienne factors in here finally. I mean, it's kind of surprising that Travis Etienne does not have a game in which he has more than 45 yards receiving in his career, which shocks me because that's basically why we all thought he was brought into Jacksonville to begin with. But no, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about these Jaguar receivers against the secondary for the Jets. Look, you got Sauce Gardner. You've got yourself Pro Bowler Sauce Gardner there. DJ Reed there. He's on the if someone goes down, he's going to make it to the Pro Bowl. Then you got Michael Carter there, maybe the best slot corner in the NFL. Get some Zay Jones on the outside there for the Jaguars. So we got all kinds of talent all over the place here. But what does that mean for fantasy? Will the good Jags receivers outperform this secondary for the Jets? I don't know. But when you look at fantasy points per yard route run, the Jets combination there of Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed is one of the best combinations of defensive backs in the league today. It is going to take a big-time performance from Trevor Lawrence, who is basically thrown for back-to-back 300-yard games there, to make sure that these wide receivers are on par, which could open things up, because we're talking about these wide receivers, but this could open things up for Evan Ingram to have a big week, especially the tight end position, because we know how valuable the tight end position is this year, because it has been absolutely a wasteland for fantasy this season. So this could be one of those games. Hey, Evan Ingram, he could be that guy that wins you your spot in those fantasy championships this week, because this is one of those matchups nobody's talking about. And it's not even the best matchup for tight ends, because Tyler Conklin against this Jacksonville Jaguars defense has an even better matchup as far as fantasy points yielded per game is concerned. So that's another one of those things you've got to take a look at here when we fill out our rosters heading into championship weekend here. And I say this because we got a game on Thursday. We got multiple games going down on Saturday. Like, this Saturday slate is absolutely insane. And then we've got a little bit of games on Sunday. I mean, we got football all weekend long, including the Christmas Classic there with the Raiders and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, before we move on to the starts and sits that I'm looking at here for week number 16, I've always been obviously I'm a Raiders fan through and through. So the Immaculate Reception has always had this weird spot in my heart, so to speak. When we look at this, I mean, as a Raiders fan, I'm not sure if he actually ever caught that. But when he made that catch, how the immaculate reception came to, it all came down to the bar. Someone was talking around Christmas time, Mother Mary, and everything else that kind of came with. That's where it came from. That immaculate reception in Pittsburgh pub. That's where that lure of Franco Harris began. But Franco Harris, he was more than just the catch. We're talking about a guy who had over 12,000 yards rushing in 13 seasons. A guy that accomplished 1,000 yards in a season on 8 different occasions. He's the all-time leading rusher in Super Bowl history there. He's also scored a touchdown in each of the Steelers' 4 championships that they won that he was part of. So when we talk about Franco Harris this weekend, when we talk about the 50-year reunion of the Immaculate Reception there that happened on December 23rd, 1972, please keep your mind, your prayers, whatever you want, on Franco Harris and his family, on the Pittsburgh Steelers and their families, and the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and everyone whose life was affected by Franco Harris. I mean this in a positive way because he, as good as he was on the field, you could hear 100 stories about the person he was off the field. The general of the Italian army, right here, right now, one of the best people that has ever stepped foot on the gridiron. Now, let's move along to the starts and sits for week number 16 as I see it this week. And I've got to say, I love myself some Daniel Jones this week, mostly because there is a rule right now in fantasy football that if you have a quarterback or a wide receiver going up against the Minnesota Vikings, you start them both. It's really that simple. So we're going to talk about Darius Slayton here a little bit later, but Daniel Jones, he has been one of those guys on a bit of a streak here as of late, getting it done with his legs and his arms. Now, we know how porous this Vikings team has been. They've given up basically the 3rd most fantasy points, I think, to wide receivers in the last 4 weeks, the 7th most fantasy points to the quarterback position over the last little while. So you're going to start Daniel Jones no matter what. He's another one of those guys who could creep into the top 10 this week as far as fantasy production is concerned. Now, a guy that I don't feel as good about, Dak Prescott going against the Philadelphia Eagles this week. Look, the Cowboys, they may just attempt to run the ball and basically control the clock. And you know what? I wouldn't blame him. Get the ball out of Dak Prescott's hands because he's been tossing more interceptions in the last little while than he has at any point in his career. So for me, if I'm the Cowboys, I'm running the ball, maybe sprinkling a pass here or there. But listen, if you're going to beat the Eagles, we've seen how the Washington Commanders did it. Run the ball, play defense, capitalize on turnovers, run the ball some more. Houston, they basically did the same thing. They just didn't have the same talent as a team as the Washington Commanders. So if the Dallas Cowboys follow either one of those kind of templates, with the talent that they have on this roster, they should be able to get the job done. Now, at the running back position, for me, it's about Jet McKinnon versus Seattle. Now, going to continue riding the hottest back in the league, especially in PPR formats there. In the last 3 weeks, McKinnon has 125 yards rushing and has scored a goal along with 17 receptions, 189 yards, and 4 receiving touchdowns. Seattle is allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to backs this season. In the last 4 weeks, they've allowed 694 yards on the ground, 7 touchdowns, 187 yards in the air, 2 receivers, along with 23 receptions. So for me, I'm looking at this right now. I'm like, hey, I'm looking at my chops. If I'm the Kansas City Chiefs, and especially if I'm Jet McKinnon, I'm like, hey, just give me the ball. I'm going to get some points here this week. Now, a guy I don't feel as good, we just talked about him and how effective he was when they played the Eagles. It's Brian Robinson versus the San Francisco 49ers. You simply can't start. You simply can't risk starting a running back when they face the 49ers, especially in the fantasy football semifinals. You just can't. It just doesn't make any sense. The risk is too high. The reward is too low. Now, San Francisco, they are allowing just 13.5 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. When we take a look at the top running backs here for fantasy so far this season, you've got yourselves the usual suspects, the Austin Eckler's, the Josh Jacobs, the Christian McCaffreys, Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson. They're kind of at the top. Then you got Aaron Jones, Delvin Cook, Joe Mixon, Miles Sanders, and somehow, some way, Leonard Fournette is still sitting here with 191.8 fantasy points in 14 contests, averaging 14.4 per game. which still blows my mind considering how we've already buried him in favor of Rachaad White, but yet he's still producing at a pretty good pace here. Now, unfortunately, some of these other guys that you can't trust this week. I mean, I look at this and Najee Harris, he's been playing good, but he's been inconsistent all season long. Travis Etienne against that Jets team, I can't trust him either because that Jets defense, it's no joke. I mean, as good as they are against the pass, they've been able to stop the run as well this season. So that's one of those things you got to keep in mind when you're looking at these rosters. Now, when we look at fantasy points surrendered on a per-game basis, you pull it up here right now, there's some teams that are really good at stopping running backs. And one of those teams recent weeks has been the Detroit Lions. And in fact, they've been pretty good all season long with their ability to stop opposing running backs, which kind of surprises you considering how bad they are at stopping quarterbacks and wide receivers from scoring in fantasy. But if you look over the last 4 weeks, they've been pretty solid at taking away that top option. But the Detroit Lions, number one. So if you're thinking about starting Dante Foreman there, forget about it. Detroit's only allowing 9.53 fantasy points on a per-game basis here over the last 4 weeks. We talked about San Francisco, but here's one for you. You may be considering Jamal Williams or DeAndre Swift this week. Carolina is surprisingly stout when it comes to defending opposing running backs, allowing just 15.43 fantasy points per game there. And they've only given up 253 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns in the last 4 contests. Now, this one might catch you by surprise here, too. The Pittsburgh Steelers, now maybe it's because their pass defense has been so porous as of late, but they have the 4th best run defense for fantasy. So Josh Jacobs is going to have his hands full this week. And, of course, if you're thinking about Miles Sanders being a good play, well, maybe think again because Dallas, they've been pretty good this season, too, only allowing 17.73 over the last 4 weeks. That's 373 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. Now, we talk about the bad. Now, let's talk about the good. We talk about Austin Eckler going against that Indianapolis Colts team that's allowing 39.5 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. We talked about Jet McKinnon there and how Seattle's allowing about 39.25 per game. How about Leonard Fournette here? Because he's getting to play against the Arizona Cardinals. We talked about that 14.4 fantasy points per game that he's averaging. Well, Arizona, they have allowed 298 yards rushing. Not a big number, but 4 rushing touchdowns. They've also allowed 1 receiving touchdown and are allowing about 32.2 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. So that's another one of those players that's a little bit lower on people's radar right now that you could effectively start here this week. That's Leonard Fournette. Now, moving along to the wide receiver position, and one of my favorite starts is going to be Darius Slayton against the Minnesota Vikings. Basically, see all the comments I said about Daniel Jones. That all stands true when we're talking about Darius Slayton because Minnesota's pass defense, non-existent. It hasn't been there. In fact, 45.78 fantasy points per game is what they've allowed over the last 4 weeks. That includes 930 receiving yards on 65 receptions, accounting for 4 touchdowns. So if Slayton doesn't score this week, I mean, I'll shave my beard. It's really that simple. I pretty much guarantee, not the mustache, because the mustache ain't getting touched. I mean, let's be honest. I ain't shaving the mustache for nothing here. But the beard, I'll let the beard go because that's how confident I am in Darius Slayton's ability here to score a touchdown here in week number 16. Now, some other guys who have good chances of producing here at the wide receiver position. Basically, DJ Moore, love it. Detroit Lions, 46.33 fantasy points they've allowed. We've also got the Dallas Cowboys, who have been really bad as of late. So, Gardner Minshew, he might be able to get the ball to A.J. Brown, might be able to get the ball to Devontae Smith. Now, Dallas Goedert, he may limit Smith's ability in that ceiling, but if you look at what the Cowboys have given up in the last 4 weeks, they have allowed 8 touchdowns to wide receivers to go along with 743 yards. And of course, you got to feel good about Chris Moore, Brandon Cooks, Nico Collins, whoever is healthy there in Houston. They get to play a Tennessee Titans secondary that's given up 5 touchdowns and 825 yards to the position in the last 4 weeks. And we all know how much we love Chris Moore, right? He may be the best Moore right now in the league. And okay, maybe DJ, but I mean, it's pretty close. Rondell, Elijah. I mean, Chris Moore has been one of the more productive wide receivers over the last couple of weeks, mostly because Collins and Cooks have missed time. Cooks sounds like he's going to be available this week, but you know what? I wouldn't count on it that much. Now, a wide receiver that I'm looking at sitting here is I'm going to flirt with the idea of sitting CeeDee Lamb. And this is only because the perimeter defense of the Eagles is so good. Darius Slay, James Bradbury. But if the Cowboys decide that they're going to move CeeDee Lamb to the slot, which I think they probably are going to do, then Lamb is going to have some success. The last time that we saw Lamb against the Eagles, he had 10 targets, catching 5 of them for 68 yards, with most of that coming out of the slot, which is somewhere he has been playing. So if you are worried about this Eagles defense, kind of like I am, keep in mind, pause for a second, think about where's that production coming from. It's coming from the slot. Now, for some other players that you have to consider sitting, how about, well, if you had any wide receivers in Baltimore, don't even think about starting them against Atlanta because A, they're not any good, and B, Falcons, they've been pretty stingy here the last 4 weeks, only allowing 18.13 fantasy points per game. Now, Vegas wide receivers, you're starting Davante Adams, so I'm not even going to talk about how good the Pittsburgh Steelers have been as of late. Where it gets kind of interesting is, what do you do with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? You're going to start both of them, but the Green Bay Packers defense there, led by Jair Alexander, they've only allowed 356 yards receiving and 2 touchdowns to the receiver position in the last 4 weeks. They've only allowed 23.23 fantasy points per game over that same period. I'm starting Waddle. I'm starting Tyreek Hill, but this has me a little bit apprehensive. But you know what? We're at this point in the season. Start your studs, especially when they're Tyreek Hill, especially when they're Jalen Waddle. These guys have already proven they can put up 1,000 yards receiving in a season. So, yeah, I'm still going to feel that I trust them. Now, who I'm not 100% sure of is a receiver there in Kansas City, Juju Smith-Schuster, Mecole Hardman if he's healthy. I mean, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, I never trusted him in the first place, but the Seattle defense, the secondary here, is only allowing 25.4 fantasy points per game this season and have allowed only just 2 touchdowns, 445 yards in the last 4 weeks. Seattle, no joke on the back end there. And then we look at the tight end position, and I told you the tight end is bad. When we look at it from a fantasy lens here right now, we got Travis Kelce, 277.9 fantasy points this season. That is tremendous. That number in itself would be right up there with the top wide receivers. In fact, he would be considered the wide receiver 3 in fantasy in PPR. Sorry, I lied. Wide receiver 5. He'd be behind Justin Jefferson, behind Tyreek Hill, behind Stephon Diggs. Davante Adams is 285.4. So he'd be between Davante Adams and A.J. Brown. So you'd have Travis Kelce is the number 5 wide receiver, if that's how we evaluate him. Then it drops down to 164 fantasy points, and that is TJ Hawkinson and Mark Andrews. 2 great tight ends. However, the production has not come even close to Travis Kelce. So if you're looking at value-based drafting, Travis Kelce has to be the front runner for the fantasy football MVP through 16 weeks, 15 weeks, whatever that happens to be, because there's not been a difference maker like Travis Kelce in the entire league right now. There is no gap like that right now. No gap whatsoever. That's 100 points plus between first and second. I mean, if you look at the quarterback position, you take 100 points. Jalen Hurts, 374.5. And I find my 264 guy, that's going to put me at the QB 8. Not a bad drop, but not 1 versus 2. At the running back, the gap of 100. You got Josh Jacobs leading in standard leagues right now. If you look at PPR, Austin Eckler leads at 307. So to find the guy at 207, you have to drop off to Joe Mixon there, who's got 203 as the running back 11. At the wide receiver position, that gap, 327 Justin Jefferson. So we got to go down to 227. That puts you at about wide receiver 8. So you're looking at quarterback 8, running back 11, wide receiver 8, just to accumulate the tight end 2 compared to where Travis Kelce is. That is how good Travis Kelce has been this season. So starts and sits, Travis Kelce is about as given. You don't even have to think about that question. If the question starts with Travis Kelce, should I? Yes, you should. There's no question about it. I don't care what the matchup is, semifinals, finals, preseason. It doesn't matter. Travis Kelce is going to start for you no matter what. After that, it really does become a crapshoot and trying to find the best available player altogether. And then maybe you can consider the matchups, but when you look at it, it's not – the tight end position is really not matchup-based. It's really just a roll of the dice because – Evan Ingram, tight end 4. George Kittle, tight end 5. Pat Freiermuth, who hasn't got a target at what it seems in 3 weeks, he is your tight end 6. David Njoku, tight end 7. Gerald Everett, tight end 8. Juwan Johnson, tight end 9. Taysom Hill comes in at tight end 10. He's not even tight end, and yet he's a top 10 tight end somehow. Zach Ertz, who's played 10 games this season, is the tight end 11. In fact, Dallas Goedert hasn't played since like week number 9, and he's your tight end 13 right now at 113.4 fantasy points. If he scores a touchdown, he jumps all the way up to tight end 8 right now. That is how close it is, basically from tight end 6 to, I don't know, tight end 18 right now. There is no gap. There's no difference. If someone tries to tell you that this is the play this week at the tight end position, they're just trying to take the best educated guess they could possibly get. And you know what? I respect that, because when I look at this right now from a tight end perspective, I'm already told you I'm going to start Chigakonkwo against the Houston Texans because I don't trust anyone else from Tennessee to catch a pass. It's really that simple. I was talking about Travis Kelce and everybody else in the tight end position. Well, Okonkwo there, he is averaging 2.63 yards per route run through 15 weeks, and you have to figure that Malik Willis is going to lean heavily on this run game, especially because Derrick Henry basically is guaranteed 200 yards rushing every time he faces the Houston Texans. And then on top of that, he needs a security blanket, and that's going to be Okonkwo. So it's that simple. Then when we look at the sit for me, I'm considering saying George Kittle because the matchup is so tough. And I hope I'm wrong this week when it's all said and done, but facing a Commanders team that is allowing just 7.8 fantasy points per game to the tight end position, they've allowed only 425 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns all season long. That's not a favorable matchup for George Kittle. However, none of these matchups any given week seem to be favoring the tight ends anywhere. So what do you do with this? What do you do with the tight end position? What can you do with the tight end position? You basically just have to plug a tight end in there, bite your lip, and hope for the best. Now, some tight ends who have good matchups this week, and I'll kind of talk you through some of these guys here as well. We talked about Houston. Houston, it could be a sneaky one. You're looking at Jordan Atkins here. The Tennessee Titans have allowed over 20 fantasy points per game to the tight end position over the last 4 weeks. Now, the New York Jets, Tyler Conklin, I mentioned that, a great matchup there earlier when I was talking about the primetime preview there. The Jaguars are allowing 19.3 fantasy points per game. Now, the Robert Tonyan, he might be another sneaky play because the Miami Dolphins, they're allowing over 16 fantasy points per game, have given up 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks and 262 yards. And then, of course, if you want to go a little bit deeper, how about Trey McBride? He might be sneaky against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who have allowed 163 yards receiving, which isn't a whole heck of a lot, but they have allowed a tight end to score 3 times in the last 4 weeks, and that's what we're about here. We're all about the tutties when it comes to fantasy football. Now, on that flip side, buyer beware. We mentioned George Kittle. I'm not going to worry about Brock Wright. You're probably not starting him anyway because Carolina's been tough all season long. Indianapolis, you're not going Mo Ellie Cox. Chicago, now listen, Buffalo is good when it comes to defending tight ends. I want to go all in on Cole Kmet here, basically because there's no one else here to funnel this offense through outside of Justin Fields, David Montgomery, Khalil Herbert, who's going to be back here this week, probably on about 35 to 40% snap count. There's no one for Fields to throw the ball to, but Buffalo is only allowing 5.88 fantasy points per game to the position over the last 4 weeks, and that includes 85 yards receiving in that 4-game sample. If I was considering starting Cole Kmet, I would strongly consider pivoting away from that right now. Now, that being said, Dallas Goedert's got a tough matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, but I'm not going to pivot away from that because Dallas Goedert is elite. I mean, he's literally a top 12 tight end right now in just 9 games of action. Another tough one here for me to get into is Gerald Everett this week. One of those fantasy darlings that I absolutely love this season, kind of a season saver, if you will. Indianapolis is only allowing 8.23 in those last 4 weeks, 107 yards. They have not allowed a touchdown in the last 4 contests. So that'd be kind of getting me back up a little bit because we know how good Indianapolis can be when it comes to defending the pass. That also includes the wide receiver position. So for me, those are some of the players I am avoiding at all costs in fantasy football this week. Those are my starts. Those are my sits. And hey, we got some great football on the way here. I mean, if we want to look at it, so I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of my rankings here from a half-point PPR perspective. At quarterback, my top 12 go like this: Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Justin Fields at number 3, Justin Herbert at 4, Joe Burrow at 5, Kirk Cousins at 6, Tua Tagovailoa. He's down one spot to quarterback 7. Geno Smith at 8. Dak Prescott at 9. Daniel Jones breaks into my top 10 as my number 10 quarterback. Trevor Lawrence at number 11. Aaron Rodgers at 12. My two biggest movers this week, I've got Derek Carr at quarterback 13, which is 3 spots higher than where the consensus has him. And Russell Wilson, I got him as my quarterback 15. That is 6 spots ahead of where the current consensus has him ranked going into week number 16. Now, over to the running back position in half-point PPR. Here is my top. Let's go top 20. We got some time here. We got a little top 20 here. Derrick Henry, number 1. Josh Jacobs, I got him 2 spots higher than consensus. I got him as the RB2. Christian McCaffrey at 3. Dalvin Cook at 4. Austin Eckler at 5. Saquon Barkley at 6. Ramondre Stevenson at 7. Nick Chubb at 8. Aaron Jones at 9. Miles Sanders, I've got him 4 spots up there as my running back 10 in a tough matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. Tony Pollard down 2 spots as my running back 11. Now, my biggest riser here to get into the top 12, how about David Montgomery? Expert consensus has him as the RB22. I say I don't need no expert consensus. I'm going to put him as my RB12 this week. So there's your sleeper running back to crack the top 12. It's David Montgomery of the Bears against the Buffalo Bills. Tough matchup, but hey, it's going to be cold. They're going to want to run the ball. And hey, it hurts a little bit more tackling somebody when it's cold out. So there could be some more business decisions made this week in that game. Joe Mixon, RB13. J.K. Dobbins, one of my other higher risers. He's up 5 spots on the consensus from RB19 to RB14. Najee Harris, he comes in at RB15. Jet McKinnon, RB16 this week. Ezekiel Elliott at 17. Kenneth Walker comes in at number 18. And maybe my biggest drop here is James Conner. He's down 9 spots. Consensus has him as the RB10. I got him down there at RB19. And rounding out my top 20, Isaiah Pacheco. He's up 3 spots from the consensus at RB20. And then, you know what? Just because I feel good, DeAndre Swift, Travis Etienne, Raheem Mostert, Leonard Fournette, and Latavius Murray round out my top 25 running backs for week number 16. Taking a look at the wide receiver position, really no shocks here anywhere until probably about the 9-10 spot there. And number 1, Devontae Adams, up 2 spots. He's my wide receiver 1 facing a Pittsburgh Steelers defense that has been much better as of late. Justin Jefferson, wide receiver 2, Jamar Chase at 3, Tyreek Hill at 4, Stephon Diggs at 5, DK Metcalf at 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown at 7, Keenan Allen, he is up 4 spots from wide receiver 12 to wide receiver 8 for me, and Garrett Wilson is up 6 spots from the wide receiver 15 all the way up to wide receiver 9 this week as the Jets take on the Jaguars. A.J. Brown against the Dallas Cowboys, he's down 2 spots to wide receiver 10. Chris Godwin, C.D. Lamb, or 11 and 12, Jalen Waddle, Terry McLaurin, DeAndre Hopkins there, round out the top 15. Then at wide receiver 16, I've got Mike Evans, followed by T. Higgins, and then one of my highest risers this week. I don't know if it's just the rookie connection here, but Desmond Ridder and Drake London only have eyes for one another. I'm going to move Drake London up 14 spots from the consensus, wide receiver 32, up to my wide receiver 18 this week, followed by Mike Williams, Christian Watson, DJ Moore, Christian Kirk at wide receiver 22. And because I've got rookie fever this late in the season, how about George Pickens up from wide receiver 36 up to wide receiver 23 in a contest against the Raiders on Christmas? Devontae Smith comes in at wide receiver 24, followed by Chris Olave. Now, finally, the tight end position here, because no one knows what they're talking about when it comes to tight ends outside of Travis Kelce being tight end 1. After that, I've got TJ Hawkinson, Mark Andrews, Darren Waller, Evan Ingram, Dalton Schultz, George Kittle. I mean, remember, I kind of said sit George Kittle. He's still a top 7 tight end here this week. We've also got Dawson Knox at 8, Chig Okonkwo there at number 9. He's up 5 spots. Dallas Goedert, the consensus currently has him at tight end 18. Nah. I got him at tight end 10. Don't you worry about that. Pat Freiermuth there, I've got him down from 8 to 11, followed by David Njoku, Cole Kmet there at tight end 13, Jawan Johnson at tight end 14, Greg Dulcich at tight end 15, and that's your top 15 tight ends heading into week number 16. With that all being said, for Tara, who could not be here this evening to go through the ViperCast episode number 160. Hey, they want to say Merry Christmas. We want to wish a very Merry Christmas to you and yours out there right now in the fantasy world. And we hope that your stockings are filled with fantasy championships. We also hope that you got them filled, that special someone, with a 30% off discount courtesy of fantasypoints.com. That's right. Fantasy Points is giving you 30% off for signing up today. Get that subscription. Whatever you want, college, NFL, DFS, they got you covered all over the place. John Hansen, Tom Broly, Joe Dolan, Graham Barfield, Scott Barrett, Wes Huber, Jake Tribby. I could go on and on. That data team there, fantastic. Best information in fantasy football, all in one spot. Don't disappoint yourself. Make sure to get the one thing that you definitely want for fantasy football and what you want for Christmas right there at fantasypoints.com. And we will see you next week. Take care now.